Because Henry was at the works, the other engines had to help with the flying kipper too. This is a special train of vans filled with boxes of fish which goes to markets in London and other places on the mainland. James did not like the flying kipper. "All those smelly vans," he complained one morning. "You can't get the smell off your tender for weeks." "I'm very fond of a good kipper," remarked his driver. "You're welcome to it," retorted James. "A right old misery today, aren't you?" said his fireman. "You got out of the shed by the wrong door this morning, and no mistake. Now get a move on, or the Fat Controller will give you something to moan about." "Pooh!" said James, wrinkling his nose. James was coupled to the vans. He had not been waiting long when a forklift truck laden with fish boxes rounded the corner and came towards him. Another, hurrying away for a new load, came too fast in the opposite direction. The loaded one swerved to avoid the other one, and its heavy load shifted. "Ugh!" he shuddered. Broken fish and boxes lay everywhere. For once, James was right. The smell was not nice. Luckily, there was plenty of time for the men to clear up the mess before James had to leave. "A good job the boxes didn't fall on you, James," said his driver, winking at the fireman. James shuddered again. The idea was too awful to think about. At last, all was ready, and the guard showed his green lamp. "Thank goodness," said James to himself. There was a speed limit in the harbour area, so James could not start quickly. The train seemed heavier than usual tonight too, so that when he reached the spot where the fish boxes had burst, he was moving at no more than walking pace. The rails seemed clean, but oil and scales from the spilt fish were still there, coating them with a slippery film. As soon as James reached the place, his driving wheels, with nothing to grip, began to spin helplessly. James did his best, but the heavy vans dragged him to a standstill. He found he could move neither forward nor back. "Fish!" exclaimed James in disgust. Men brought hoses and washed the rails. James grew very wet and uncomfortable. Then they put sand on the rails in front of each driving wheel, and James was at last able to move his train. He was very late, but at least he was off the fish quay. To say he was glad would be putting it mildly. Henry found life boring at the works. The men worked hard to make him better, but it seemed ages before he was ready. At last, however, when he had passed the test to make sure he was mended properly, men came to repaint him. But Henry saw that instead of nice green paint, they had something very different in their paint pots. "That's not right," protested Henry. "The Fat Controller wants me to be green with red stripes, not red all over like tomato sauce." The painters laughed. "You'd look very handsome, Henry," they said, "but don't worry, this paint is a special sort of undercoat. You shall have proper green with red stripes before we've finished." "Undercoat," muttered Henry in disgust. "Whatever would the other engines say if they saw me looking like this?" The men laughed and carried on painting. Early next morning, his driver came. "Wake up, Henry," he said. "There's an emergency at the big station, and the Fat Controller says you're to help." "But I can't go like this," exclaimed Henry. "They'd all laugh like anything." "No choice," said his driver. "The diesel pulling the express has failed, and the Fat Controller needs you to take over. It's either us or a long walk for the passengers, and you know the Fat Controller wouldn't like that." The fireman raised steam as quickly as he could, and Henry, blushing with embarrassment, set off for the big station. The Fat Controller was pleased to see him. "I feel so silly looking like this," complained Henry. The Fat Controller laughed. "You do look unusual, Henry," he agreed, "but you have helped me out of a very awkward situation, so don't worry about it." But Henry did worry. Soon, too soon for Henry, it was time to start. The express was heavy, and Henry felt the drag of the coaches. "We'll need help on Gordon's Hill today," remarked his driver. But they were in trouble earlier than that. As they approached Edward Station, the brakes went wrong on the last coach of the train, and they had to stop and uncouple it. To make matters worse, Donald, who should have been there to help, had been called away. Henry had to push the coach into a siding himself, and, without Donald, there was no one to help him on the hill. "Never mind," comforted his driver. "You can do it. You're an enterprising engine, remember?" Henry snorted. He didn't feel very enterprising just then. men at the works had mended Henry well. His driver gave him as good a start as he could. It was hard going, but now Henry felt fired with determination. Let them laugh at my red paint, he snorted. I'll show them. Slowly he struggled upward. I can do it! I can do it! I can do it! He panted. Oh dear, will the top never come? Then, suddenly, there it was. I've done it! I've done it! I've done it! He puffed proudly. After that, it was much easier, and they reached the other railway quickly. The fat controller who had been on the train came to congratulate Henry. "Well done, Henry," he said. "I'm very proud of you. Perhaps all my engines should be painted red, but you have certainly earned your proper green with red stripes." Which, of course, is just what Henry got. And when he at last returned to the shed, there was a warm welcome for Henry the Green Engine. One evening, Percy was bringing empty stone trucks from the harbour. He was tired of his quarrel with Thomas and wanted to be friends again. He had had a good day and was feeling extra pleased with himself. He was so busy thinking how he would tell Thomas and Toby about his expert handling of the trucks that he forgot to keep a good lookout. Too late, he saw a broken branch hanging over the line straight in front of him. "Oh, he groaned. He tried to stop, but his brakes wouldn't hold him. "Ouch!" he exclaimed a moment later. Percy was more startled than hurt, but his front was still sore when they reached the shed. "It's your own fault," said Thomas unsympathetically. "You should keep a better lookout. I've no patience with you." "Pooh," retorted Percy huffily. He forgot his good resolution and talked to Toby for the rest of the evening. Percy didn't speak to Thomas the next day either. "I say, Toby," he said in the shed that evening, "what's a drip, do you know?" Toby pondered. "It's when rain comes through a hole in your cab and fireman hasn't got time to mend it," he decided at last. "That's silly," objected Percy. "I heard a boy on the platform call his friend one this afternoon. I'm sure he couldn't have come through a hole in my cab," he added earnestly. Thomas was tired of being ignored. "That's different," he interrupted loftily. "The boy just thought his friend was being a coward, or silly, or a spoil-sport." Percy thought about this. "So if," he suggested reflectively, "if you stopped me from doing something nice, would you be a drip, Thomas?" "You're the drip," answered Thomas crossly. "Now go to sleep like a sensible engine and stop talking nonsense." Percy was offended. Instead of going to sleep, he became even more determined to pay Thomas out. Next day, Henry's train was late at the junction. When Thomas set out along the valley, he was trying to make up for lost time. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and something hard hit the bottom of his left-hand water tank. "Ouch!" exclaimed Thomas and stopped. As he did so, he felt water splashing cold against his wheels. "One of your side rods has broken," said his driver. "It's swung up and punctured your tank. We'll have to get help." At Farquhar, Percy was shunting. The station master came up. "Leave those trucks, please, Percy," he said. "Thomas has got a hole in his water tank. There's water dripping everywhere, and he can't get home on his own." Percy was still cross with Thomas. "I won't go," he said. "Thomas called me a drip. Let him jolly well stay there and drip himself." "But what about Annie and Clarabelle and the passengers?" reminded Percy's driver. "Do they deserve to stay out all night too?" Percy was sorry at once. "I forgot them," he said. "We must rescue them in case they turn into drips too." Everyone was glad to see him, and the passengers thanked him for coming. "I'm sorry I was rude," said Thomas as Percy helped him back to the shed. "That tank of mine turned me into a bigger drip than we expected, didn't it?" "Can we be friends again, please?" Percy was delighted to agree. Mavis is a diesel engine belonging to the Farquhar Quarry Company. She's in charge of the stone trucks at the quarry, and when Toby is busy or there are too many trucks for him to manage by himself, she is allowed to bring a loaded train down to Farquhar. She enjoys this because the journey gives her a chance to stretch her wheels. Besides, she sometimes finds it dull up at the quarry with no one to talk to but trucks. For most of the way, the line runs beside a road. Mavis is always very careful, especially at the place where Thomas once had an argument with a policeman. A road crosses the line here, and though there are warning signs, some of the cars and lorries come round the corner much too fast. They make Mavis nervous. "There'll be an accident one day," Mavis's driver often says as they pass the place, and she feels sure he is right. One day, Mavis was late. The trucks had been in all the wrong places, and she had to waste time sorting them out. As she came down the line, she felt them surge against her. "Stop pushing," she growled. They neared the crossing, and Mavis saw a lorry coming towards them. "He'll stop when he sees us," she thought. But she couldn't know the lorry driver was new to the island. The last thing he expected to see was a train. Much too fast, the lorry approached the corner. Too late, the driver realised it was sharper than he expected. He swerved, and at that moment he saw Mavis halfway across the road. He braked hard and swung the steering wheel, but he was too late. Mavis, who had already stopped, watched in horror. "Ouch!" she exclaimed. "That hurt." "I didn't push him over," she cried in alarm. Her driver laughed and jumped down. "No one's blaming you," he said, "but I hope the lorry driver is all right." The lorry's right-hand door was deep in the ditch, but now a figure could be seen struggling to climb out at the other side. Mavis's driver went to help. "Is that a train?" the man demanded. "It certainly is," laughed Mavis's driver. You must be new here not to have seen us before." Mavis's front was bent, but she wasn't badly hurt. Her owner sent her to be mended and asked the fat controller if he could borrow Toby while she was away. "What about the trucks down here, sir?" Toby asked anxiously. The fat controller nodded. "I'm afraid it will mean more work for you, Percy," he said, "but Toby's side plates make him the only engine who can go up there. You remember what happened to Thomas, don't you?" And with that, they had to be content. While Percy was away, Terence had done all the shunting in the yard. "Adaptable," he boasted. "That's what my owner says I am. Go anywhere, do anything, that's me. You take my advice and scrap your rails. Broaden your outlook, like me." "Pooh," said Percy. "Me plough a field? I prefer to stay on my rails, thank you." "Steam engines did plough once upon a time," Terence chuckled, "and ran on roads." The engines remembered Trevor and had to admit that Terence was right. Repairs to Mavis took longer than expected, and Toby became used to trundling off to the quarry each morning. Because of Toby's small water tank, his driver and fireman had arranged with the quarry manager that they should bring loaded trucks down to Farquhar at lunchtime instead of later in the day. It saved time too, for Toby would otherwise have needed an extra journey to fill his water tank. This way, he delivered the trucks and got water in one visit. Time passed and the weather became colder, with hard frosts during the night. They didn't worry Toby. His fire kept him nice and warm, and he puffed happily to and fro, arranging the trucks, taking them down to the yard and bringing back empty ones. One night it was particularly cold. The ground froze solid, and even Toby felt chilly. Brrr! He shivered as he left the shed and set out, light engine, along the line towards the quarry. When the ground freezes, it swells. At the road crossing, where Mavis had had her accident, the frost had swollen earth in the ruts beside the rails so much that Toby's wheels were lifted clean off the track. "Oh, he exclaimed. "What's happening?" "Whoa there, Toby," said his driver at once, and put on the brakes as hard as he dared. Shakily, Toby came to a stop with all 6 wheels firmly on the roadway. "Oh dear," he said, looking at the grass verge in front of him. "Now what?" His fireman jumped down. "No problem," he said. "With care we can have you back on the rails in no time." "I don't see how," said Toby, sadly. Directed by the fireman, the driver carefully reversed Toby along the ruts his wheels had just made. At last, with a thud and a jolt, Toby felt the rails safely beneath his wheels once more. He heaved a sigh of relief. "Well done, Toby," said his fireman. "Now I'll spread a few hot ashes from your fire along there so that it doesn't happen again. Then we can get safely up to the quarry and no one will be any wiser." But they reckoned without the fat controller. When Mavis was home after being mended, he came to see the engines. "What's this I hear, Toby?" he asked. "Trying to be a traction engine, were you?" Toby blushed, but the fat controller wasn't cross. Toby told him about Terence. The fat controller laughed. "If I were you," he said, "I should leave the roads to what they were made for. You stay on the rails. You'll find them much more comfortable." Toby the tram engine was quick to agree. "The bridge across the river needs repair," the fat controller told the engines. "I shall have to make a weight limit across it for a while. Percy and Daisy will be all right, and Toby too, but Thomas is too heavy." Thomas looked anxious. "How would you like to go and help Edward?" suggested the fat controller. "Can Annie and Clarabel come?" asked Thomas. The fat controller shook his head. "They'll be needed here, I'm afraid," he said. "Daisy can't carry all your passengers on her own." Percy promised to look after Annie and Clarabel, but they were sorry to see Thomas go. To cheer Thomas up, Edward took him to see Bill and Ben, the twin engines who lived at the China Clay Harbour. "Oh dear, not another blue engine," said Bill cheekily. "First Edward, then Donald and Douglas, and now—" "Don't forget Gordon," interrupted Ben. "He came here once by mistake, so he said. I don't think he enjoyed it much," he added innocently. The twins both chuckled, remembering. "No, but seriously, Edward," said Bill, "why doesn't the Fat Controller paint engines a proper colour, like us, for instance?" Thomas let off steam indignantly. "Let me tell you," he began. "All right, you two," laughed Edward. "Go and move those trucks, or there won't be room for any more." Bill and Ben, unabashed, went off happily. "You just don't have to take them too seriously," explained Edward. Thomas smiled ruefully. "I wish I knew how you deal with them," he said. Near the harbour, the line crossed a lane. The crossing had no gates. The lane led to a farm which made butter and supplied eggs and milk to shops in the town. One morning, the farmer had difficulty starting his lorry. He did it at last, but the lorry jerked along in fits and starts. The farmer was worried about his load of milk and butter and eggs. "That milk will be churned to butter soon," he muttered to himself as he neared the level crossing. The lorry lurched across the rails. The back wheels were just clear when its engine made a noise like a tired sheep and stopped. The back of the lorry was still jutting out over the railway line. The farmer struggled to start it again, but it would not go. He had just got down to telephone for help when he heard a train approaching. Thomas wasn't going fast. When he saw the lorry, he set his brakes hard, but he couldn't stop. "Ugh!" he exclaimed and stopped. "Just look at my poor old lorry," said the farmer, emerging from behind the hedge where he'd been sheltering. "What a way to make an omelette!" The driver made sure that Thomas wasn't hurt, then stood back and surveyed the mess. He began to laugh. "It's not funny," said Thomas crossly. An egg yolk trickled down his nose and burst on his buffer. "You're not standing where I am," said his driver. "You look just like a scrambled egg, Thomas." "Well, if a scrambled egg feels as sticky and wet as I do, then it's very uncomfortable," said Thomas. "Please clean me." Both driver and fireman tried hard, but the heat of Thomas's boiler had cooked the eggs and they were stuck fast. "Sorry, Thomas," said his driver at last. "We can't block the line any longer. We shall have to go on." the end of the line, Thomas was taken to Bill and Ben's yard to be cleaned. The twins were there. "Hello," said Ben. "What's this?" "Must be a new engine," said Bill. Ben inspected the arrival carefully. "No, Bill," he said, "that's not a new engine. It's Thomas." "But it's our colour, Ben, and Thomas doesn't think our colour is proper for an engine." They heard a grinding noise. "Are your joints stiff, Bill?" asked Ben. But it wasn't Bill's joints. It was Thomas, gnashing his teeth. It took a long time to clean Thomas properly, and the twins kept teasing him until Edward told them to stop. "A party of railway enthusiasts is coming soon," he said. "I shan't bring them unless you behave." Bill and Ben were excited. Enthusiasts always made a fuss of them and took their photographs. "When?" they squeaked in unison. Edward smiled and winked at Thomas. "Next week," he said, "but not if you don't behave." Bill and Ben promised that they would. "Is it next week?" they asked Thomas each morning. Thomas enjoyed keeping the twins in suspense. "Next week never comes," he would answer mysteriously. Bill and Ben weren't worried. They kept urging their crews to polish them. "What's the hurry?" they laughed. "The enthusiasts aren't going to eat their breakfasts off you, you know." "No," Bill whispered, "but they might if we were Thomas." The twins thought this a huge joke. It was lucky that Edward and Thomas weren't there to hear it. At last the day came, and the drivers and firemen agreed to give the engines an extra polish. They were sparkling when Thomas arrived with a special train. Many of the enthusiasts had notebooks, and almost all had cameras. Bill and Ben didn't know which way to look, but they loved it. Then the visitors queued up for a ride in either Bill or Ben's cab. Their cabs were low, and several visitors forgot to duck, but they didn't seem to mind. The enthusiast's visit was almost over when a shunter came running up. "A ship needs moving before the tide goes down," he said. One of you see to it, please. Ben went at once, and most of the visitors went too to watch. Only one man stayed. He had a camera which took instant pictures. "Just one more," he kept saying. Soon even Bill tired of him. The photographer screwed his camera to a tripod and pointed it at Bill. "This is it," he chortled. "What a picture." Ben's fireman ran up to them. "Ben needs help," he said. "The ship's going aground, and he can't move it on his own." "Right, Bill," said his driver. "We can't wait any longer." He turned a tap, and with a hiss and a roar, Bill vanished in a cloud of steam. At that moment, the photographer pressed the button. When the steam cleared, Bill was hurrying off to help his twin. The photographer peeled the cover from his instant picture, looked at it, and threw it down in disgust. Fudge! Quickly, the engines were coupled together. "When I say heave, heave," instructed Ben. 1, 2, 3, heave! Come on, puffed the engines. The cable tightened and stretched. At last, with a shudder, the ship slid off the mud and, towed by the engines, glided into deeper water. Bill's driver found the discarded photograph on the floor. All it showed was a cloud of steam with, very dimly, Bill's funnel at the top. He showed it to Bill. "What a picture," remarked Bill, to no one in particular. Trevor, the traction engine, was feeling depressed. He couldn't breathe properly. "Your boiler needs mending," said his owner, the vicar, "but I can't afford it at present." One morning, the vicarage telephone rang. The vicar answered it and then hurried out to see Trevor. "You may be a bit under the weather, but you can manage this," he said. "The farmer has a tree down and wants you to saw it up for him." When Trevor had steam, they went to the farm and set to work in a field near the railway, trying to clear the fallen tree. Thomas passed by with Edward's coaches. He whistled cheerfully. Edward liked trucks and had been delighted to let Thomas have his coaches for a while. When Edward passed later that morning, he was pulling trucks with a sort of tent over them. These were specially for carrying china clay. The men called them hoods. Why hoods? Thomas had asked Bill and Ben. The hoods are those things like tents, explained Bill. They keep the clay dry, added Ben. Wet clay goes in tanks. But to Trevor, they were simply trucks. He was enjoying himself. The only thing he liked better than sawing logs was giving children rides. He chunted happily as the pile of logs beside him grew. Edward returned with some empty trucks. As he passed the place where Trevor was working, the line seemed to wobble under him. That feels like a loose rail, he thought. We'd better tell the maintenance people. At the harbour, Edward exchanged the empty trucks for full ones and set off for the junction again. Trevor dozed. The wind had dropped and it was comfortable in the autumn sunshine. It seemed no time at all before he heard Edward coming back. Trevor whistled a cheerful greeting. He was watching Edward and so did not see one of the trucks, 6 from the end, sink, jump and shudder just at the place Edward had felt a weakness in the line that morning. The guard, safe in his van, blew his whistle. Edward, far in front, didn't hear it and hurried on without realising what had happened. But Trevor was closer to the guard's van than Edward. He heard the whistle and looked back to see the trucks lying at strange angles on the track. He whistled in horror. "Stop, Edward, stop!" Edward heard that. "It's Trevor," he cried anxiously. "What's wrong?" "We'd better stop and see," said his driver. The fireman climbed onto the tender. "Phew," he exclaimed. "Look, it's not Trevor. It's us." The guard went to protect the train, the fireman went to the farmhouse to telephone for help, and the breakdown gang soon cleared the line. That evening, the Fat Controller came to see Trevor. "Thank you, Trevor," he said. "I've heard about your boiler, and because you saved a nasty situation, you're to go to my works to be mended. Would you like that?" "Oh, sir," said Trevor, "thank you. That would be lovely." China clay is not quarried as other minerals are. It is washed out of the ground with strong hoses. Then the mixture of clay and water has to settle and be dried before Bill and Ben can take it away. Part of the line which the twins used to reach the China clay workings runs near the sea. There is a hollow in the land just here which often floods after heavy rain. Local people call this hollow the drain. The autumn gales which had brought down the farmer's tree for Trevor to cut up were also causing rough seas and high tides. When rain came too, the engine crews looked gloomy. "A really high tide now," said Ben's driver, "could make real trouble at the drain." But though pools of water lay on either side of the line, they grew no larger. Bill and Ben puffed happily to and fro, replacing loaded hoods with empty ones. They forgot about the drain. Then the rain began again, and the wind strengthened. As the engines went to the clay pits that morning, their drivers noticed that the water in the drain was rising. While Bill arranged the empty trucks, Ben prepared to leave with a train of full ones. At the drain, he found that the water was level with the top of the rails. "Come on," said Ben bravely. "We must get through, if only to get help for Bill." "Go back, go back," the wind seemed to shriek. Ben took no notice. He was halfway over when the rising tide, whipped into a huge wave by the wind, swept across the line. "Oof!" spluttered Ben as water crashed against his side. "Help!" He was stranded in the middle of the drain, with cold seawater lapping his wheels. The fireman set off to find help. "Keep on the sleepers," advised the driver. "We don't want you swamped as well." The water reached the fireman's waist, but he struggled on. At last, cold and soaking, he reached the yard. Thomas was there, wondering where his trucks were. His driver wasted no time. "Ben must be rescued," he said. "We need a steel cable, a pair of waders, and determination." "Yes," said Thomas doubtfully. He understood the cable, but he wasn't sure about determination and didn't even know what waders were. Thomas stopped at the water's edge. Ben was delighted to see him. The fireman fastened the cable end to Ben's front coupling. Then he uncoupled the trucks so that Bill, who had come up behind, could pull them clear. "Right," he said as he joined Ben's driver in the cab. "Let's go." Poor Ben had no steam left to whistle, so the driver and fireman waved to show Thomas they were ready. Carefully, Thomas took the strain as he pulled Ben. Slowly, with water cascading all round him, Ben came out of the drain. Once he was clear, Thomas was properly coupled to him and helped him back to his shed. "Thank you, Thomas," said Ben gratefully, and his eyes twinkled for the first time for several hours. It was 4 days before the water in the drain subsided. When Bill reached home, both twins agreed that it would be ungrateful of them ever to tease Thomas again.
A strong wind had been blowing all day, and that night it grew worse still. The next morning, the fat controller was eating toast and marmalade for breakfast when his wife came in. "Oh, Topham dear," she sighed. "There's been slates blown off the roof of the house in the night." "I'll get someone to replace them, my dear," he promised. "No use until this gale has died down, though. They'll blow off as fast as they're put on." At the shed, the engines had been teasing James. They were remembering the time he had been spun around and around on the turntable and had to wait for the wind to drop before he could be rescued. "Be careful, James," chuckled Henry. "Mind you don't go on any turntables today." James was indignant. "Careful yourself, Henry. Make sure you don't stick in a tunnel when you need to take shelter." Henry didn't care a bit, and the engines laughed as they went to collect their trains at the station. Henry's first stop was at the station before the viaduct. "Be careful, Henry," the station master warned him. "The wind on the viaduct is very fierce today." But Henry was lucky. The wind dropped for a few moments at just the right time, and he brought his train safely over. The station beyond was in an exposed place too. Henry knew this, but he was so pleased at crossing the viaduct that he forgot. "Fancy worrying about a bit of wind," he said to himself. "Now I've no more stops until the workstation. That's one in the buffers for silly little James." As he rattled through the station, he saw something that made him whistle shrilly in horror. A few hundred yards in front, a tree was suddenly uprooted by the gale and crashed across the line. "Ooh, groaned Henry, and his driver slammed the brakes on hard. Henry skidded along the rails, coming closer and closer to the tree. He shut his eyes and waited for the impact. Nothing happened. Henry slowly opened his eyes and looked again, to find he had stopped inches from the tree. Phew, he thought. I let off steam with relief as the guard came running to see what was the matter. Henry pushed the coaches back to the station. And when the passengers found out what had happened, they came to thank Henry for preventing a nasty accident. Well done, Henry, said James when he found out. Perhaps it's useful to be able to stick when you need to, after all.
Percy wasn't feeling well. His joints ached and he couldn't breathe properly. The Fat Controller came with an inspector who examined Percy and made notes in a small book. When they had finished, the Fat Controller looked serious. "You'll have to go to the works, Percy," he said. "They'll make you better, but it will be a long job." "Who will look after my trucks?" said Percy. "Toby can't do everything on his own." "He certainly can't," agreed the Fat Controller. "I shall borrow another engine." The only engine the other railway could spare was a diesel shunter. Doug was at the works when he heard an oily purring noise. recognised the new arrival at once. "It's Diesel," he thought, and scuttled behind the shed. "What's he come back for?" he said crossly. "The Fat Controller sent him away in disgrace." The Fat Controller was cross too, but he needed another engine, and Diesel was the only one available. When Diesel reached the junction, Thomas was waiting with Annie and Clarabelle. "Hello," said Thomas suspiciously. "You've come to help Toby, I suppose. Well, no tricks, mind." Diesel looked pained. "Tricks? What, me?" he asked smoothly. "I'm just delighted to be of assistance to you really useful engines again." "Good," replied Thomas shortly. "I'll believe that when I see it." Diesel pulled some trucks carefully to Farquhar, where Toby met him. "Oh," he said, "it's you, is it? Well, do your shunting, please, and then take these stone trucks to the harbour." Thomas and Toby made it clear to Diesel that they would stand no nonsense. Diesel listened, purring quietly. "Yes, Thomas," he said smoothly. "I understand, Thomas. Of course, Thomas." The trucks knew that the Fat Controller had once sent Diesel away for troublemaking. "Let's have some fun," they sniggered. They teased Diesel and tried to annoy him. Slipping their brakes on, accidentally, on purpose. One morning, they went too far. "Here's Evil Diesel," they whispered as he came into the yard. "Oily creature." "Yes, Thomas," they mimicked. "Of course, Thomas. Anything you say, Thomas." Diesel could stand no more. He roared furiously. "I'll teach you." growled furiously as he cleared up the mess. "Come on, you. Any more nonsense and I'll squash you all flat, just like your friend." The Fat Controller was furious. "You will go back to the other railway as soon as I can arrange it," he thundered. When the Fat Controller had finished with him, Diesel was glad he was going home. A day or two later, Daisy was running downhill when she felt something warm and wet splashing her wheels. At the next station, she felt hot and her joints were stiff. "You've lost your oil," said her driver. "Bertie will have to take your passengers." Then Thomas arrived, with Annie and Cloudwell full of people on their way home from market. Thomas started confidently up the hill. But his wheels began to slip on Daisy's oil, and he slithered to a stop. Then, "Help! Help!" he whistled. "I'm slipping back!" Near the bottom of the hill were special points to divert runaway trucks off the line. Thomas could not stop his heavy train from pulling him downhill towards these points. "That's torn it," said the guard. He helped the passengers back to the station. Diesel was waiting at the next station, pulling his last train before going home in disgrace. He sniggered slyly when he heard about Thomas. "Serves him right," he said. Then Diesel remembered that while Thomas was blocking the single line, he couldn't get past. The trucks tittered as he pushed them crossly into a siding. "Bother," thought Diesel. "I shall have to help, or I can't go home." He set off to the rescue. At the oily place, he stopped, before creeping carefully forward until he could be coupled to Thomas. Meanwhile, workmen had put sleepers under Clarabel to make a slope up to the line. Then they cleaned the oil off the rails and put dry sand on them. At last, everything was ready. Diesel dug his wheels into the sand and pulled, but he was careful not to pull too hard in case a coupling broke. Clarabel was unhurt, so they went back for the passengers. Then, using plenty of sand, both engines pulled the train up the hill. "Thank you, Diesel," said Clarabel. "You were splendid." Diesel began to feel sorry that he was going home. Clarabel asked the Fat Controller to forgive him. And now, everyone hopes Diesel will come again. Diesel hopes so too.